Thank you very much. Since Brother Preston said I was in my early 30s, and that was 50 years ago, I asked him to go back there and get me a stool. It doesn't mean I'm going to talk any longer. But it does mean that I'll conserve my energy, because I started off this morning going to Birmingham. And that was at a Rotary Club. And I went there because one of the untold stories of the civil rights movement was the role of business in bringing about change. I came here because a young woman whom I consider one of my heroes, Diane Nash, who was really one of the leaders of the student movement from Nashville, Tennessee. And I was working in New York and had bought a house in Queens and thought I had it made. And we saw Diane and John Lewis, who is now my congressman, and Bernard Lafayette and James Bevel and Jim Lawson and other people you might know or not know. But that, seeing them on the battlefield in Nashville, Tennessee, made my wife say to me, it's time for us to go home. And so I quit my job and sold my house and went back to Atlanta, not knowing what I'd do. I tell you that because it's the only way to try to help me and you understand that nothing about this movement that you hear about was really planned or organized or calculated. It was a happening. It was a happening of the Spirit. And we used to sing a song, "The Spirit is a-moving all over the land." And I didn't even know about the Spirit here. We knew about Birmingham because of the dogs and because of the fire hoses. And we knew about the University of Alabama and Arthurine Lucy because George Wallace stood in the door of the University of Alabama and refused to let her come in. But you were blessed with a good governor here, a governor who understood, as they tried to understand in Atlanta, but not at the University of Georgia, that racial conflict and controversy was bad for both government, business, and gave a human rights stain on the state. And so when Governor Hollins decided that South Carolina wasn't going to do what University of Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama did, he set South Carolina apart. But now, I must confess that I don't know what happened once they got here. And that's not just my fault. That's the fault of Dr. Henri Treadwell. For I have known her for at least 25 years, and I didn't know she integrated this place. That's the humility that she continues to portray. I have known her at the Kellogg Foundation, moving monies all over the world and helping to save the world from every kind of evil. I know her now at the Morehouse Medical School, and I see her all the time, and she never told me this. So shame on you. But I'm going to get you to kind of bring me up to date after this, because that's sort of what's the matter with our history. The people who genuinely were involved and did it don't talk about it, because they know that it was just by the grace of God that they happened to be in the right place at the right time and were courageous enough to do the right thing when doing the right thing might have cost you your life. But they realized that they're here by the grace of God. And because the world wasn't nearly as bad as we thought it was. And while the people who were in the newspapers ranting and railing got most of the publicity, there were quiet, decent, loving human beings that extended a hand of welcome in class or in the dormitory or in church or wherever they might feel secure and safe in the midst of a South that was going through a turbulent time of change. Now remember, I was in Birmingham talking about businessmen, because really the businessmen helped to settle the Birmingham civil rights movement. But I'm going back to Birmingham Sunday to commemorate the death of 4 little girls and 2 boys whose names we don't know, who were killed on this day, this Sunday, 50 years ago also. So when we talk about 50 years ago and try to make sense of it, it really is difficult. And when people ask me the simple question, are we better off now than we were then? Did a black president solve all our problems? You have to say, hell no. But have we made more progress than our parents or even we thought we would make? I asked somebody as I came in today, what's the percentage of black students in the colleges in South Carolina? And the estimate was system-wide, maybe as much as 30-35%. Well, now, that's a long way from 3. Of 30,000 here, 10-20% minority, probably 150 different nationalities on this campus. This has become a global university, not a provincial southern school. And so things are different. There has been enormous progress. Martin Luther King organized the civil rights movement and accepted as a mandate to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. I would say that legal racism is dead. Now that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as insecurities of class, creed, and color. There are individual insecurities. Stealing is illegal, but folks still steal. And people get caught. And they are now punished. That didn't used to happen 50 years ago. We went to Birmingham because 60 black people's homes had been bombed in 1961 and 62. And there was nobody arrested, no serious investigations. And Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth's church had been bombed 3 times. And on the 3rd time, on the 17th of December in 1962, he said that's enough. And he came over to Atlanta, and he said to Dr. King, this nonviolence isn't working unless we do it aggressively. Said we're doing a passive nonviolence, but we're sitting back and we're getting killed and nobody's making any difference. And Fred had been jailed and beaten several times. His church now being bombed for the 3rd time. And he said, Martin, we need you to come over and help us change segregation. And if we can change Birmingham, we can change the world. And that's exactly what happened. I was actually surprised that Dr. King agreed to go, because I knew the history of Birmingham. And I knew that It wasn't called Birmingham for nothing. And he laughed and joked and said, you know, some of us are not going to make it out of here. He said, but don't worry. You got to die for something. And it's better to go over there and die for a cause than be hit by a truck jaywalking. And he said, you're going to die. You got nothing to say about it. Everybody's going to die. You can't say when you're going to die. You can't say how you're going to die. The only decision you can make is what is it that you can live for that you would not mind dying for. And then after he got you all nervous and scared of the possibility, he'd start cracking you up by saying, but don't worry, if they get you, I can preach you into heaven. And then he'll start telling you all of the things he knows about you that are wrong and weak and no good and trifling. But he said, the Lord is forgiving and you can make it on grace and mercy. And he actually made us laugh at the possibility of our own death. But it wasn't our death that we were worried about. The reason Fred Shuttlesworth had to come to Birmingham, from Birmingham to Atlanta to get Martin Luther King was all of that bombing and all of that Dynamite Hill is what they call the Negro neighborhood, where people started building nice homes after the Second World War. None of that was getting any attention. And I found out from a young CBS reporter why it was important for Martin Luther King to be there. When he came to me and he said, Andy, I know you don't like us getting in your way with the press, but I got to keep a camera on Dr. King at all times. Because if they shoot him and I don't get a picture of it, I lose my job. So he was putting his life on the line. And he was taking his life to Birmingham to get the press to pay attention to the plight of the poor, of the needy, of the black citizens of Birmingham. And he had decided that that was why he was put on this earth. Now, we didn't know what we were doing. Somebody wrote a brilliant plan that sounded good, but we did all of that and nothing worked. And finally, at the moment when we thought we had failed, and when even the people who invited him to come over had decided that this was not working, and there were 500 people in jail, and they had decided that they had signed the bonds and attached them to their mortgages. And they began to be worried about the consequences of their mortgages being foreclosed. They came to Martin and they asked him to please call this movement off. And he listened to them for about 2 hours. And then he got up and he went into the bedroom at the motel. And when he came back, he had on his overalls. And he said, I know you're right. We probably have failed. He said, but I can't quit. And the only thing I can do is go to jail with the people who have believed that we could change the world without violence. He said, I still believe it's possible. I don't know how. We've done the best that we could. Well, when he went to jail, a gentleman by the name of Bull Connor decided that he was going to teach everybody a lesson. So he brought out the fire hoses and police dogs, and he hosed down half the town that was gathered in Kelly Ingram Park. And it really looked bad with dogs snarling and barking at people. I was out there, and I still don't remember anybody getting bit. But that was irrelevant. It was an un-American kind of activity to put police dogs and fire hose people. And they were mostly young people. But it changed the world. A group of ministers actually wrote an ad in the paper calling for him to leave town and blaming him for segregation. And it got him so worked up that he started writing an answer to it. And he didn't have any paper, so somebody had left him a copy of the New York Times. And so he wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail around the margins of the New York Times. And when he ran out of space, he started writing on the toilet paper. And he slipped it out of the jail, and when we published it, it explained better than it had ever been explained before what this movement was all about, and that it was basically a moral, religious movement. It wasn't political, it wasn't even economic at that point. It was essentially about whether or not we were all brothers and sisters, and whether we would learn to live together as brothers and sisters or perish together as fools. It awakened the world, and that's what led to the March on Washington. But as soon as the March on Washington was over, when everybody sort of caught the vision of the dream, 3 weeks later we come back, and these 4 little girls were killed in Sunday school. And you wonder why. Well, we wear these crosses around our neck. We bow before them in our churches. But we don't remember that the New Testament is about God saving the world through the suffering of his Son. We've heard people say there's no remission of sins without the shedding of innocent blood. We've heard Dr. King say that unearned suffering is redemptive. And we've heard in church history that it was the blood of the martyrs that became the seed of the church. That essentially our Christian nations and our Judeo-Christian heritage is a heritage that somehow said that it is better to suffer nobly than to kill. And we brought that back from Jesus of Nazareth. We had to learn about it from Gandhi of India, because we couldn't quite see Jesus in the South because we were looking too much at the Christians in the church. But when we saw Jesus through the eyes of Gandhi, then we went back and read it, and it made sense. And when we look at what had happened to us and in our lives since Martin went to Montgomery in 1955 to get away from politics in Atlanta. He didn't want to be involved. He didn't want to be controversial. He wanted to finish his PhD dissertation. And he picked Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery because it was probably the most conservative Sediti Baptist church in the South. And 2 weeks after he mailed his dissertation back to Boston University, Rosa Parks sits down in a bus. And the other preachers were so tainted by various conflicting histories. The women of Montgomery said, let's give this young man a chance to lead. And he found out about 6 o'clock at night that he was going to have to be the leader of this movement at 26 years old. And if you listen to the speech he gave then with no time for preparation, you see that only a God-chosen man could rise to that kind of occasion and deliver the kind of address that he gave. And that happened all the way through this movement. He didn't know he was going to write a letter. He didn't know he knew he was going to jail. But he never knew how it would come out. but he had been stabbed by a black woman in 1959. And when they removed, he used to joke about that. He said, I'm glad I got stabbed in Harlem. They know how to deal with knife wounds there. He said, I'm just another case. He said, if somebody had pulled that letter open out of my chest, it was pressed against the aorta of my heart, I'd have died in my own blood. But in Harlem, they know how to take care of knife wounds. So they cut to open his chest, they cut a cross. And so when it healed up, he said, every morning when I brush my teeth, I have to look at the cross and realize that this day could be my last. So it gets your attention. It makes you wonder what you're living for. And that kind of God-ordained destiny led this movement through the difficulties that you really ought to take the time to read about, because they're repeating themselves. The 4 little girls in Birmingham remind me of the 400 children in Syria. And I don't know what you saw about the president's struggle on Syria, but what I saw was God moving in mysterious ways. John Kerry made a mistake and said that if the Syrians give back their weapons, we might not bomb them. And lo and behold, even the Russians, you know, the godless communists, jumped at the opportunity to say, we have a plan to get the chemical weapons out. But the message that we learned in Birmingham and Selma and all of us was that you don't overcome violence with violence, but somehow you have to find a way to give your opponent a face-saving way out. And if you're faithful in the pursuit of your nonviolent actions, then somehow God will make a way. And that's what we lived through 50 years ago. It was up and down, and it was worse than you can ever imagine to go from the heights of the March on Washington to the death of 4 little girls in Birmingham. And as soon as you begin to grieve your way out of that and recover, the president's assassinated. And Dr. King said, well, we can count our days. If 400 Secret Service can't protect the President of the United States, you know that any day might be our last. And so you all better start living like it's your last day and quit fooling around. You know not the day nor the hour when your end will come. And so there was a sense of urgency. But there's still a sense of urgency. I jumped back and forth. I learned a lot of lessons, how God moves in history. And I don't think it's an accident that Kerry made this slip and that the Russians jumped on it. I say that's not coincidence. Coincidence, I say, is God's way of remaining anonymous. And when people do accidental things that somehow coalesce into meaningful history, that's the hand of God moving through our lives. The economists talk about the invisible hand. Scientists are beginning to understand that there are differences and difficulties in the universe that, there's no longer this division between religion and faith. We realize that this is such a complex world order that we are, as my friend John Bryant says, quoting Deepak Chopra, we're not really physical beings having an occasional human experience. We're spiritual. We're spiritual beings. Got that backwards. We're not physical beings having an occasional spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings, and this is our occasional human experience. So we live in a world filled with a loving, forgiving, merciful spirit that we don't understand. And all of our traditions are running counter to this biblical vision of a world order. But we don't understand how we move money electronically. We sure don't understand how our cell phones work. But we do things with them that my 2-year-old runs an iPad. My 2-year-old grandson. I also got a 25-year-old granddaughter. But you know, we live in a world that is fearfully and wonderfully made. But it's so complex that there are no simple answers and there are no easy solutions. That freedom is a constant struggle. And the things that we've learned over the last 50 years were captured in a song. Freedom is a constant struggle. We've struggled so long that we must be free. And yes, we are free. We're freer than we've ever been before in life. But the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. Einstein said that he almost, maybe perhaps used 5% of his brain capacity. You probably haven't used, like me, 1.5% of ours. But the capacity to comprehend what's going on in this universe and the opportunity for us to take on this challenge together is what our struggle was about. It wasn't about black folk being free to sin like white folks sinned. That ain't worth fighting for. If they're going to hell and you fighting to go to hell with them, you know, I mean, there's got to be something different when we come together. There's got to, and not that white folk were the only ones sinning. I mean, there's plenty of sin to go around. But the movement was not about equality to sin. It was about equality of opportunity to serve. And if there's equality of opportunity to serve, to learn, to teach, to give, we can transform the chaos of this social, political, and economic order into something meaningful that the New Testament calls the kingdom of God. Now, whether you believe it or not, I don't care. But it is, and you better get with it. And the only way I can explain the long way that we've come, if I had said even to Martin Luther King, the dreamer of the 20th century, on the road from Selma to Montgomery, that, you know, I want to be the congressman from Georgia one day, and the mayor of Atlanta, and maybe I'd like to be the ambassador to the United Nations too. He would have pulled me on the side, set me down under a tree, got me some cold water and said, son, you've been in the sun too long. That's not going to happen in our lifetime. It didn't happen in his lifetime, but I've been around long enough to realize that his short 39 years made it possible for all of us to have opportunities that we could not have, that did not exist when he was alive. And now the challenge to redeem the soul of America from racism, war, and poverty, I think we're doing okay on racism. I even got the Russians working with us to have less war. Jimmy Carter made peace between the Israelis and the Egyptians. And for 40 years, they had no war. And peace is possible on this planet. But it's something that we've got to constantly work at. And the thing where we haven't made much progress is poverty. And we haven't made much progress in poverty in the United States because we ended up going from a national economy to a Western European, Euro-American economy, now to a global economy. So they have actually wiped out more poverty in the last decade than in any other time in human history. But the poverty that's been wiped out has been in China and India. 1 billion people between the two countries. But that wasn't the work of the communist Chinese or Indians. That was the work, first of all, of American missionaries in China. Second of all, American investors, the business community, the models that business community decided that the billion Chinese, and so Coca-Cola decided if they're going to be 1 billion Chinese, they want to sell 1 billion Coca-Colas, so they moved in there. Everybody that made something started looking at that market. And that's what brought China out of poverty. The next big market on the planet is Africa. And in your lifetime, the largest middle class on the planet will be on the African continent, because there probably will be 2 billion people on the African continent by 2025. And Africa is not what you see in the movies or on the news. What you see is the clashes and the conflict. And it's like judging the South by what you saw in Birmingham. But I'd rather judge the South by what I saw in the stadium last Saturday, or what we see on the football fields in the SEC. You know, that's where my hope is. I mean, the churches aren't that integrated. That on a level playing field where people can be judged by their strength and their content, their character, their courage, and their ability to function as a team, that has got to change the South. The South that you read about now is not the South that exists. I don't know whether you've had it here, but University of Georgia elected a young black man student body president, and so did Mississippi State. And there was a Miss Alabama, who happened to be an African American, and there's something going on around here that ain't figured out in the statistics yet. And it's not showing up in the politics, but it's just about to break through. The business development on the planet Earth is going more reasonably in the Southeast than it is almost any place else on the planet right now. And we think we're in a recession. We're in a recession because we're waiting for somebody else to bring us jobs or to create jobs. But one of the things we've got to remember is that most of the jobs in the world are created by small business. So instead of looking for a job when you graduate, think about how you're going to invent one when you graduate. In fact, don't even wait till you graduate. Millard Fuller, who founded Habitat for Humanity, left the University of Alabama a millionaire. I said, how could you get to be a millionaire and go to school making honors, graduating with honors? He said, it was just an accident. He said, a friend of mine's mama called me and said, next Saturday is my son's birthday. If I send you $25, would you get him a cake and have a little party for him? And he said, sure. And he said, when he hung up, he realized at the University of Alabama, there are probably 10 or 15 people every day having a birthday. And he went out around Tuscaloosa and outside of the university, and he signed up a lot of black women to make cakes. And then he wrote to people a month before their birthday, asking their mamas to send him $25, and he'd have a birthday party for their child. And he organized his friends, and before he left school, he was a millionaire. But he didn't want to just get rich. He turned his entrepreneurial talent into creating Habitat for Humanity. And that's what we have to do. We have to free up our minds, free up our souls. We have to open our hearts and let God and other people's problems become our problems. And we have to watch this world of ours become more and more like God's kingdom. The University of South Carolina 50 years ago had a wonderful hour. We didn't make enough fuss about it. It was a little too quiet. But the success of those who have come through these doors has made an impact on the world that we don't yet realize. And we haven't hardly begun. And so I don't know what your future may hold. I know that everything that was a problem in my time in college became my mission in life. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and I don't know what I did. But Ralph Abernathy used to say, I don't know what the future may hold, but I know who holds the future. And Martin Luther King used to say, truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, but the scaffold sways the future, because behind the dim unknown standeth God beneath the shadows, keeping watch above his own. And so I don't know about you, it's been 50 years, but there's a modern spiritual which says, Lord, I don't feel no ways tired. We've come too far from where we started from. And nobody ever told us that the way would be easy, but I don't believe he brought us this far to leave us.
Sir, John Lewis recently on NPR was asked by a 20-year-old his advice. And as you know, I think John Lewis was about 23 or 20 years old when he joined Martin Luther King. And his advice was to all young people today, stand up, shift the paradigm, do whatever you can, stand alone. Don't let anyone deter you, but don't despair. What would be your advice for a 20-year-old today?
Well, I'd say amen to that, of course. And actually, it was John Lewis, along with Diane Nash, that just watching them lead the sit-ins and the freedom rides that made me leave my job in New York and come back to work with Martin Luther King. I should take this opportunity to say, I came back here to work with Septima Clark of Charleston, South Carolina. And I was the administrator of her project, which was started on Johns Island, where she was teaching people to read and write in order to register to vote on a ferry boat coming from Johns Island to the mainland. The workers had an hour every morning and every afternoon, and she rowed the ferry boat with the workers and gave them lessons in reading and writing in order that they could become registered voters. And during that time, from 1961 to about 1965, I went all over the state with her. Now, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I had to do something. And I'm a firm believer that there's a purpose in each person's life, that there's something in life that only you can fulfill. And I've tried to do the thing that nobody else wanted to do. I didn't want to go into politics. I was looking for somebody else to run, and then I ran. When nobody else would run, they said, you run. But there is something that God put you on this earth for. And I just say, keep your heart and your ears and your mind open. And do the best you can one day at a time. And when you stumble and fall, don't get discouraged. Get up and keep on going again.
I have a similar question. I'm a 20-year-old social work major, and I was wondering what advice you would give to someone who wants to help out in the future with the poverty situation, and also what advice you would give when we're facing hardships in our profession and feel discouraged.
One thing is to, Dr. King used to quote the prophet Jeremiah. And he used to say that Jeremiah said when he got discouraged, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?" But he said black men and women in slavery took Jeremiah's question mark and straightened it out into an exclamation point. And they said, "There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There's a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. So when I get discouraged and think my work's in vain, soon comes the Holy Spirit to revive my soul again." And so I just say, wait on the Lord. You know, you get knocked down, but just get up and keep going. Now, specifically for social work, there's some critical social work issues that unintended consequences of bad policies. People are talking bad about food stamps now, like food stamps were never invented for poor people. Food stamps were a subsidy for farmers. And poor people used to have to pay for them. You could have to pay $2.50 to get $25 worth of food stamps until, as first thing I did when I went to the cabinet meeting with President Carter, I said, "Can't we do something about that?" And he said, "I don't see why we can't." And he did an executive order making food stamps free. That's the first time and that was 1977. But up until that time, food stamps was a farm subsidy for big farmers to keep prices stable. Also, a lot of the welfare policies ended up saying, for instance, you can't get money if you're still living with you in your mother's house. So you took mothers away from grandmothers. And you can't have money if you got a man in the house that's unemployed. So you separate. I mean, the welfare social work policies of the 50s and 60s did more damage to the black family than slavery did. And so we need some serious social work policy. And we have a public policy school down there in Atlanta. And when you finish here, you can come down there and get a graduate degree if you don't mind. But we're going to have to rethink policies. It does not make sense to pay $40,000 a year in Georgia to put somebody in jail when you could send them to Yale for that. And my oldest daughter's a lawyer who was practicing in death penalty cases. And all my daughters were single back then. And they came home, she said, "You know, all the black men are not gay and they all are not in Vietnam." She said, "They're in jail." She said, "I meet more brothers down in the Reedsville Penitentiary." Said they have taught them more law in a law library in a prison than some of the guys that were studying in the Library of Congress with me at Georgetown. And so some of the brightest young people that we have get pushed out of school. And if you're out of school by 6th grade, and the reason I know this is I got put out of school in 3rd grade. And the boy that got put out of school with me, I didn't see anymore. Till I was between my junior and senior year in college, And I didn't know whether I was going to flunk out or graduate. And I was thinking I better quit and join the Army or something, you know, and not push it, my luck too far. And this guy, I was lifeguard at a swimming pool, he came and fell in the water and was high on something. And I pulled him out, and he said, "You don't remember me. We got put out of school together in the 3rd grade in Bellina C. Jones School." I said, "Well, where have you been?" He said, "I've been in and out of just about every jail in Louisiana, including, you know, Angola Penitentiary." And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm thinking about dropping out of college." He cussed me like I don't know what. And it was obvious with his arguments that he was as smart and probably smarter than me and certainly tougher than me, because he had made it through the prison system and still had his head screwed on right, and I'd been in college and my head was all messed up. So if we look at the people in jail as wasted talent and find ways to, we've got to rethink the whole prison system. But that's just 2 areas of public policy that social workers, and I think to be a good social worker, you got to know some economics. And because economics, what's wrong with the economics is the people who study economics are all rich people who study to figure out how they're going to manage the money their parents leave them. And we need some folk who are poor, who want to figure out how to manage the money that is in abundance in this universe. There's enough money on this earth. We have more money than we need to solve the problems. We understand the needs better than we have ever understood them in history. And there's better technology than there's ever been in human history. But we don't have a vision to get need, money, and technology together. And maybe that can come out of your social work.
Thank you, Ambassador. As an architect of the Civil Rights Act, I was wondering what you thought the implications might be of the Supreme Court recently overturning Section 4 of the law.
Well, it was really bad, because what they're saying is this has been successful, so we're going to end it. We have, you know, good politics. We have better politics in the South. Now, the reason they could do that was that the Civil Rights Act was basically targeted at the states of the Confederacy. But the problems of voting are as bad or worse in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Florida, which were not included under the Civil Rights Act. Those are the places where we've had serious voter repression and redistricting. But see, I maybe put too much trust in God, but it's maybe the laws of the universe. That Dr. King used to say that evil is self-defeating because it bears within its own being the seeds of its own destruction. Now, I'm not saying this is going to be interpreted politically, but I don't mean it politically. But one group of people have redistricted to guarantee that they can hold those seats in one party. And the reason I could hold my seat was it was half black and half white. And the reason John Lewis can hold his seat is, you know, there can't be enough, you can't put together a coalition. If you put together a black coalition, the white folk are gonna save it. If you put together a white coalition, the black folk are gonna save it. But if you put everybody in the same thing, the most militant black folk, which means quite often the most irrelevant black folk, will end up dominating the election, and so the crazies take over. I think, I think like Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And President Obama says, yeah, but you got to help bend it. And we do. But I never jumped to the conclusion. I mean, the Supreme Court was our big ally, and we could not count on the Congress. But then we got the Supreme Court and the president, and then we got the Congress and we lost the president. And, it's never easy, but it's always possible. Truth crushed to earth will rise again.
Mr. Ambassador, I certainly am weak in language if I say thank you. Thank you again for some of us white folks who were inspired by We Shall Overcome. I Have a Brother, and the beautiful songs. I think I paid my dues to a degree by spending a career at Allen University, Voorhees College, where I wrote the history, Shaw University, dealing with a multiplicity of cultures. And inspired by the vision of you and Dr. King and others, my words will probably be cheap because I have not paid the high costs that you and Dr. King and others have paid. But I have paid some dues. I have marched with Jesse down at Edgefield. And I have marched, frankly, and this will surprise the academic world, against abortion because this did violate a sense of ethics. I did appreciate in reading this brochure where you said you interpret all of your vocations, and you make me a little envious when I see that list of doctorates. I have just one, but under a man that instituted the desegregation process at USC, Dr. Whitten. But the fire that was lit by this movement has to be a God-inspired movement, a prophetic movement. I agree with you. Now I'm going to ask you a tough question, even though you are sophisticated, and you probably think, am I gaining your confidence too far? But I want to give you a tough question because you can handle it. Way back in 1863, a president by the name of Lincoln had not a national day of prayer, Mr. Ambassador. He had a national day of confession. In a day where the country was split, where thousands, perhaps a million, would have died, more than any of our wars, he said it's time to confess. A national day of confession. When I write about that, better than a national day of prayer, people think this might be heretical. But I think maybe it is time, in a day of coalition, causes, but also pollution, moral pollution that can go through the arteries of our system. Perhaps we need a sense of humility in spite of the nuclear power, and maybe we do need a national day of confession, beginning here tonight. May I have a response, Mr. Ambassador?
No, I think you're onto something, and I did not know that. I did not know of a National Day of Confession, but I know that the most terrible time in this nation's history was the time of the Civil War. It was brother killing brother. It was cousins, and it really was our bloodiest war, I think, and certainly percentage-wise per capita. And were it not for it was not religiosity, it was the humility and the spirituality and the refusal to hate. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was our first, I mean, he had a nonviolent spirit, even as he defended the Union. And when we talk about nonviolence, we say there are three types of violence. There's aggressive violence, retaliatory violence, and defensive violence. And we condemn retaliatory violence and defensive and aggressive violence. but it's hard to to condemn defensive violence, but you take on violence of any kind with a heavy heart. And I think a National Day of Confession, in fact, I don't know your name, but I'll give you credit for it. The next time somebody invited me to a national prayer breakfast, and I'm going to turn it into a breakfast of confession.
Appointment with the faculty, but they called me Dr. J. Thousands of African American students would say, Dr. J, what are you going to say today? And I would say this: if you play, and if you play, just play, someday you pay. And thank you for teaching me how to teach and to think. The entire black community deserves a vote of commendation from me with that kind of background. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, this is very significant because, you know, one of the historic accidents is that Martin Luther King's wife, my wife, and Ralph Abernathy's wife all came from Perry County, Alabama. And they all went to the same high school. And one of the things that happened there was that a young Quaker missionary came and got Jean a scholarship to Manchester College in Indiana, and her sisters, Coretta and her sisters, went to Antioch College in Ohio. Those, I think, were only two of the colleges that I know of that had New Testament nonviolence as required courses. So when Martin and I married these little country girls, they were far better prepared. And I always say, you know, if I had married any of the girls I was dating at Howard, or if he had married any of the girls he dated at Spelman or in Boston University other than these little country girls, you probably never would have heard our name.
Good evening, Ambassador. My name is Antonio de la Cova, and there are 3 Afro-Cuban human rights leaders actually visiting the United States. Dr. Oscar Elias Bisset, you have Luis Garcia Antunes, and Berta Soler. She heads the Rosa Parks human rights movement in Havana. These people have been persecuted, prosecuted, just about everything you talked about today. They've been going through this in Cuba for decades. They are political prisoners. Dr. Bisset, a physician, has spent 14 years of his life as a political prisoner. He's called the Cuban Nelson Mandela. Also, Berta Soler has been in prison in Tunis. These people are in the United States now. For the first time, the Castro regime has allowed them to leave the country to visit. They need help here.
Well, what I hope for, and I think that before he leaves, one of the things that I expect President Obama to do is normalize relations with Cuba. And I think it's long overdue. And I think the best thing to do for human rights is to break down the barrier and let's flood them with tourists. And 100,000 tourists a year would have changed Cuba 25, 30 years ago. So,
for disagreeing, but Cuba has over 1 million tourists last year from Europe, from the United States. That's not working. These Afro-Cubans are going to be the future leaders of the country. They need your help. They need the help of your foundation. They need the recognition of with the suffering.
Well, if they come to Atlanta, they can find me with no trouble.
I'll make sure that they know that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Ambassador, hi. I am Renee Bell. I am your homie. I know about the airports before they were over the highway. I know about Wesley Chapel before the buses were out there. I know about the Olympics. I was there. But right now I'm here in South Carolina, and I have tears in the back of my eyes, and my heart is aching. I am in federal court here in South Carolina, and I am in desperate need of an attorney. I live in a shelter. I've been approached by the police walking home from work. I'm in desperate need, and I'm asking, is there any way you can help me?
I'm not sure, but I would imagine that somebody in this audience can. And I really don't know, but I think that the spirit of this occasion, somehow we ought to be able to find you some help.
Thank you.